She is the most famous survivor in history who never actually survived. For a century, the world chose to believe a fairy tale about a lost princess found in Paris. But the reality was a horror story hidden in a basement. She was born into the richest family on earth, yet she died wearing her fortune as a shield. She sewed pounds of diamonds into her corset, hoping for protection. But the gems didn't save her. They made the bullets ricochet, turning a quick execution into a slow, agonizing slaughter by bayonet. Her wealth didn't buy her freedom. It bought her a more painful death. Her name was Grand Duchess Anastasia. The tragedy of Anastasia began, in a sense, before she was even conceived. It began in the nurseries of Windsor Castle and Osborne House, where her mother, the future Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, was raised. Alexandra, born Princess Alex of Hesse, was the favorite granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She was a sunny, golden-haired child, but she carried a ticking time bomb in her genetic code. Queen Victoria was the most famous carrier of hemophilia in history, a genetic mutation that prevents blood from clotting. In the days before modern medicine, it was a sentence of torture and death, a royal disease that Victoria unwittingly exported to the ruling houses of Spain, Germany, and finally, Russia. When the shy, serious Nicholas II, the Tsar of all the Russias, fell in love with the beautiful, melancholic Alex, he was not just choosing a bride, he was choosing a destiny. They were married in 1894, just weeks after the funeral of Nicholas's father, a wedding that took place amidst black crape and mourning veils, a grim omen that the superstitious Russian people never forgot. They whispered that the new German bride came behind a coffin. They did not know that she brought a coffin with her, hidden in her blood. By the summer of 1901, the pressure on this marriage was already crushing. The primary duty of a Tsarina was not to be beautiful or intelligent, but to be a reproductive machine for the dynasty. The Russian throne, governed by the Pauline laws, could only pass to a male heir. Nicholas and Alexandra had already produced 3 daughters, Olga, Tatiana, and Maria. 3 healthy, beautiful, and constitutionally useless children. The court was growing restless. The public was growing cynical. The German woman, as they called Alexandra, seemed capable only of producing girls. When the Empress announced her 4th pregnancy in late 1900, the entire empire held its breath. Cannons were primed in every fortress from St. Petersburg to Vladivostok. The protocol was strict: 301 gun salutes for a boy and 101 for a girl. The church bells were ready to ring. The prayers were feverish. Alexandra, deeply religious and increasingly desperate, immersed herself in mysticism, praying to icons, convinced that God would finally grant her the son who would secure the throne and justify her existence. On June 18, 1901, at the Peterhof Palace, the Russian Versailles of fountains and golden statues on the Gulf of Finland, labor began. The court waited. The Tsar paced. And then the news came. It was a girl. The cannons fired only 101 times. The disappointment was a physical weight that settled over the palace. There were no street parties. The Russian people, exhausted by poverty and yearning for a sign of strength from their monarchy, shrugged. Another Grand Duchess, another dowry to pay, another useless mouth in the imperial nursery. They named her Anastasia, a name derived from the Greek word for resurrection or breaker of chains, because the Tsar, in an act of supreme optimism, pardoned a group of rioting students to celebrate her birth. But there was no breaking of chains for the family. The chains of duty and biological failure were pulling tighter. From her very first breath, Anastasia was the 4th In any other family, the baby is the center of the universe. In the Romanov family, Anastasia was a consolation prize. She was born into a vacuum of anxiety, a place where her parents looked at her with love, certainly, but also with a silent, gnawing fear that the dynasty was ending. Yet nature often has a sense of irony. Into this atmosphere of gloom and stifling protocol, nature sent a hurricane. As she grew from a bundle of lace into a toddler, it became immediately apparent that Anastasia Nikolaevna was not like her sisters. Olga was sensitive and intellectual. Tatiana was regal and organized. Maria was placid and angelic. Anastasia was a force of pure, chaotic energy. She was short, sturdier than the others, with strawberry blonde hair and blue eyes that sparkled with a terrifying intelligence. The family called her Malenkaya, but her more appropriate nickname was Shvibzik, the Russian word for imp. While her sisters were painting watercolors and practicing their conjugations, Anastasia was climbing the tallest trees in the Alexander Palace Park and refusing to come down until the frantic officers of the guard begged her. She was a mimic of genius-level talent. She could observe a pompous general or a visiting duchess for 5 minutes and then reproduce their voice, their walk, and their mannerisms with devastating cruelty, sending her family into fits of laughter. But there was an edge to her humor. It was physical. It was loud. She would cheat at card games, kicking her opponents under the table. She would hide rocks inside snowballs to make them hit harder. She once rolled a metal weight inside a piece of hollow bread and handed it to a bewildered senator to see if he would break his teeth. This was not merely high spirits. This was a child screaming for attention in a house that was perpetually looking past her, waiting for a brother. That brother finally arrived in 1904. Alexei, the golden boy, the heir, the joy that erupted in Russia was boundless. Finally, the German woman had done her job. The dynasty was saved. Anastasia was 3 years old when she was effectively dethroned from the nursery. The entire emotional gravity of the family shifted to the baby boy. But within weeks, the horror set in. Blood began to ooze from the baby's navel. Dark, terrifying bruises appeared on his limbs from the slightest touch. The doctors were summoned, and the verdict was whispered in the deepest recesses of the palace. Hemophilia. The Victoria curse. The blood did not clot. A bump on the knee could cause internal bleeding that would last for weeks, causing agony so intense the child would beg for death. A nosebleed could be fatal. This diagnosis was the single most defining event of Anastasia's life. It transformed the Romanov court from a center of power into a hospital ward. To protect the dynasty, the Tsar and Tsarina made a fatal decision: the secret. No one outside the immediate family and their closest servants could know the truth. If the people knew the heir was a cripple, the Romanov autocracy, which relied on the image of divine strength, would collapse. And so the gates of the palaces were locked. The family withdrew from society. They stopped giving balls. They stopped attending the theater. They retreated into the Alexander Palace at Tsarskoe Selo, turning it into a gilded cage to hide the dying boy. Anastasia grew up in this hermetically sealed bubble. She was not a public figure. She was an inmate in a luxury asylum. She saw almost no children her own age. Her world was restricted to her 3 sisters, her sick brother, her parents, and the sailors of the Imperial Guard who stood watch outside her door. Imagine the psychology of a child raised in this environment. Anastasia was healthy, vibrant, and bursting with life. Yet she lived in a home where death was a constant physical presence. She learned to walk on tiptoes when Alexei was having a crisis. She learned that a sunny afternoon picnic could end in screaming terror if Alexei stumbled. She absorbed the anxiety of her mother, Alexandra, who began to disintegrate mentally under the guilt of having passed the disease to her son. Alexandra became neurotic, hysterical, and obsessed with religion, spending hours praying on the hard stone floors until her knees bled. Anastasia watched her mother, the most powerful woman in Russia, reduced to a weeping, terrified wreck. To cope, Anastasia cranked up the volume of her own personality. If the house was filled with the silence of the sick room, she would fill it with noise. If her mother was crying, she would force her to laugh by wearing false teeth and putting on a play. Her naughtiness, the pranks, the rudeness to tutors, the refusal to study, was a desperate performance. She was the court jester trying to distract the king and queen from the executioner standing in the corner. Within this isolation, the four sisters formed a unit so tight it practically became a single organism. They created an acronym from their initials, OTMA. They signed letters with it. They gave gifts with it. But within OTMA, there were two pairings. The big pair, Olga and Tatiana, were the adults, the serious ones. Anastasia belonged to the little pair with her sister Maria. They were dressed alike, often in identical white dresses with colored sashes, and treated as a set. But the dynamic was unequal. Maria was the sweet, pliable follower. Anastasia was the leader, the bully, the mastermind. She dominated her older sister, often teasing her mercilessly. Yet, their bond was absolute. They shared a bedroom, a plain room with camp beds, hard pillows, and cold baths in the morning. They had no privacy. They had no secrets from each other. They were growing up in a bell jar, observing the world only through the windows of the palace or the portholes of the imperial yacht, the Standard. It was on the Standard, the floating palace where the family spent their summers cruising the fjords of Finland, that Anastasia experienced her only taste of freedom. On the yacht, the protocol was relaxed. The officers were young and handsome. Anastasia, even as a young girl, was a relentless flirt. She charmed the sailors, learned their naval slang, and climbed the rigging. There are photographs of her on the deck, her hair windblown, laughing with a genuine, unbridled joy that is absent in the formal court portraits. But even here, the shadow followed them. A sailor was always assigned to watch Alexei, to catch him if he fell. The secret was stowed away in the captain's cabin. As the 1900s bled into the 1910s, the desperation of the Empress led to the entrance of the most controversial figure in Anastasia's life, Grigory Rasputin. History paints Rasputin as a mad monk, a sexual predator, a dark wizard. To the Russian public, he was the Antichrist. But to Anastasia and her sisters, he was something entirely different. He was our friend. He was the only man who could stop the screaming. When Alexei was bleeding, when the doctors admitted they could do nothing, Alexandra would send for the peasant from Siberia. Rasputin would arrive, smelling of stale wine and unwashed humanity, and he would pray. And miraculously, impossibly, the bleeding would stop. Science has never fully explained it. Perhaps he used hypnosis to lower the boy's blood pressure. Perhaps his presence calmed the hysterical mother, which in turn calmed the child. But to a young girl like Anastasia, the mechanism didn't matter. The result did. She saw him save her brother's life with her own eyes. This reliance on Rasputin created a bizarre, warped reality for the Grand Duchesses. They were the daughters of the Tsar, yet they were encouraged to treat a semi-illiterate peasant as a holy figure. Rasputin had access to the nursery. He would sit on their beds and tell them stories of Siberia. He would kiss them goodnight. There is no evidence that Rasputin sexually abused the girls, but the intimacy was inappropriate and scandalous. The governess, Sofia Tyucheva, was horrified to find Rasputin in the girls' bedrooms while they were in their nightgowns and complained to the Tsar. The result? The governess was fired. Alexandra would tolerate no criticism of her savior. Anastasia wrote letters to Rasputin that are uncomfortable to read today, filled with a naive spiritual infatuation. "My darling, precious, only friend," she wrote, "how I long to see you again. I dreamt of you last night." It was not a romantic love, but a desperate spiritual dependency. Anastasia was being taught that the safety of her family depended not on the army or the government or the people, but on the prayers of this one strange man. It isolated her further from the reality of Russia. While the newspapers were calling her mother a German spy and Rasputin's whore, Anastasia was sewing shirts for Father Grigory and believing he was a saint. The most terrifying manifestation of the secret occurred in 1912 at a hunting lodge in Spala, Poland. Anastasia was 11 years old. The family was on vacation when Alexei, jumping into a boat, hit his groin against the side. A massive internal hemorrhage began. A tumor the size of a grapefruit formed in his abdomen. The pain was beyond human comprehension. For weeks, the heir to the throne lay in a small dark room, screaming in agony. The screams were so loud that the servants had to stuff their ears with cotton wool. The Tsar and Tsarina sat by his bedside, watching their son die by inches. Anastasia and her sisters could hear the screaming through the walls. They huddled in their room, terrified, unable to play, unable to laugh. The bulletin issued to the press lied, claiming the Tsarevich had a cold or a sprain. Anastasia was forced to smile at official dinners, while her brother's wails echoed in the corridor. It was a psychological torture that forged a will of steel in the young girl. She saw death up close. She saw the helplessness of her powerful father. And then once again, a telegram was sent to Rasputin. He replied, "The little one will not die. Do not let the doctors bother him." And the bleeding stopped. The lesson was reinforced with iron certainty. The world outside is dangerous. Only the family and the friend are safe. By 1913, the Romanov dynasty celebrated its tercentenary, 300 years of rule. It was a spectacle of medieval grandeur. Anastasia, now 12, was dressed in silver brocade and a kokoshnik encrusted with diamonds. She stood in the cathedrals of the Kremlin, watching the masses bow to her father. To the eye, the dynasty looked invincible. But Anastasia, standing on the balcony, saw something else. She saw the faces of the crowd. She saw the poverty. And she likely felt the tension in her father's arm. The Schwibzik was growing up. She was beginning to understand that the golden cage was also a fortress under siege. She was intelligent enough to sense the hatred directed at her mother, the whispers about Rasputin that were becoming shouts. Her childhood, that strange mixture of luxury and terror, was coming to an end. The clouds of the Great War were gathering on the horizon, and the imp was about to be thrust into a world where pranks could not save her, and where the Victoria bloodline would demand its final terrible price. The year 1914 opened like a wound. Anastasia was 13, on the precarious bridge between childhood and adolescence. In the photographs from this time, you can see the change. The round, chubby face of the imp was refining, the jawline becoming sharper, the eyes more watchful. She was still the family comedian, the one who would climb onto the roof to take a picture or wear a pair of false teeth to a state dinner. But the laughter was becoming brittle. The atmosphere in the Alexander Palace was shifting from anxiety to a grim, fatalistic dread. The Tsar was distracted, constantly in meetings with ministers who looked grave and pale. The Empress was more withdrawn than ever, her health failing, her dependency on Rasputin absolute. Anastasia, with her antenna for emotional currents, vibrated with the tension. She spent more time with her camera, obsessively documenting her world, the dogs, the gardens, the family tea parties, as if she subconsciously knew she needed to capture the evidence of their existence before it was erased. When war was declared in August 1914, the initial reaction was a wave of patriotic hysteria that washed over the palace, momentarily drowning out the fear. Crowds gathered in Palace Square singing "God Save the Tsar" and kneeling before Nicholas II. For a brief shining moment, the German woman and the weak Tsar were beloved again. Anastasia stood on the balcony of the Winter Palace, caught up in the fervor. She watched the sea of people and felt the surge of unity. It was a drug, a powerful intoxicant that made the family believe the nightmare of revolution had passed. They were safe. The people loved them. They were Russians, united against the enemy. But the enemy was Germany, the land of her mother's birth, the land of her cousins, the land of the Kaiser who was her father's relative. The war was a civil war of the royal blood, a family feud played out with machine guns and mustard gas. The reality of the war crashed into the fairy tale with brutal speed. The Romanov women did not sit idly by. Alexandra, determined to prove her Russian patriotism, transformed the opulent Catherine Palace into a military hospital. She and the two older daughters, Olga and Tatiana, trained as Red Cross nurses. They donned the gray Sister of Mercy uniforms, stripping away the silks and pearls. They scrubbed floors, boiled bandages, and stood in the operating theater holding the hands of men whose legs were being sawed off without anesthetic. This was not a ceremonial role. They were knee-deep in blood and gangrene. Anastasia and Maria, being too young for the surgical wards, Anastasia was only 14, were assigned a different role. They became the patrons of a smaller hospital within the palace grounds. They were the hospital visitors. If Olga and Tatiana were the hands of the medical effort, Anastasia was the heart. She visited the wounded soldiers every single day, and here, in the wards, filled with the smell of iodine and rotting flesh, the Schwibzik found her true calling. The girl who had been the court jester for her sad parents now became the jester for the dying. She would walk into a room of groaning, mutilated men and turn on the light of her personality. She played checkers with them. She wrote letters home for the illiterate peasant boys who had been dragged from their farms to die for her father. She learned to smoke cigarettes, sharing them with the soldiers, sitting on the edge of their beds, listening to their stories of villages she had never seen and lives she could barely imagine. There's a profound poignancy in the accounts of Anastasia during this time. Survivors recalled her infectious laughter, the way she would tease the soldiers, making them forget their pain for an hour. She put on plays, dragging Maria along, performing silly skits to the sound of applause from men with bandaged stumps. She was breaking the protocol of centuries. A Grand Duchess of Russia was not supposed to treat a peasant conscript as an equal. She was not supposed to know their names or smell their sweat. But Anastasia crossed the divide effortlessly. For the first time in her life, she felt useful. She was not just a spare princess. She was a source of comfort. She fell in love with them in a chaste teenage way, and they worshipped her. She kept a photo album of her patients, annotating it with funny captions. But she also saw the horror. She saw men die. She saw the cost of her father's war. She saw the gray masses of Russia not as a threatening mob, but as human beings, Ivan, Dmitri, Pavel, who were bleeding to death. This experience stripped away the insulation of her royal upbringing. It made her tougher, more grounded, and perhaps more aware of the tragedy that was unfolding. However, the war that Anastasia tried to heal in the hospital wards was destroying the foundation of her home. The Russian army was being slaughtered. Millions of men were dying. The supply lines collapsed. People in the cities were starving, and the blame fell squarely on the German spy empress and her mad monk. While Anastasia was holding the hands of soldiers, the public was whispering that her mother was sending maps to the Kaiser and sleeping with Rasputin. The hatred directed at the Alexander Palace became toxic. Anastasia could feel it. When she went out in the carriage, the crowds no longer cheered. They stared, sullen, angry, hungry stares. Sometimes they shouted. The breaking point came in 1916. The Tsar, in a disastrous decision, left the capital to take personal command of the army at the front. He left the government in the hands of the Empress, and by extension Rasputin. The result was chaos. Ministers were hired and fired on Rasputin's whim. The government collapsed into incompetence. Inside the palace, the atmosphere was funereal. Then in December 1916, the news came. Rasputin was dead, murdered. But he wasn't killed by revolutionaries. He was killed by the family. Prince Felix Yusupov, the husband of the Tsar's niece, along with Grand Duke Dmitri, a cousin, had lured the friend to a cellar and poisoned, shot, and drowned him. The murder of Rasputin shattered the fragile psychological ecosystem of Anastasia's family. For the public, it was a cause for celebration. People kissed strangers in the street. But for Anastasia, it was a terrifying blow. Our friend was gone. The man who kept Alexei alive, the man who had been the spiritual anchor of their lives, had been butchered by their own relatives. It was a betrayal that signaled the end of loyalty. If the Grand Dukes were killing the Empress's favorite, then no one was safe. Anastasia attended the secret funeral of Rasputin, held on a bleak winter morning in the park of Tsarskoe Selo. The Tsar was back from the front, pale and defeated. The Empress was a ghost. Anastasia stood in the snow, mourning the holy man who the world called a monster. It was the winter of their discontent, and the wind was howling through the cracks in the dynasty. By February 1917, the end arrived not with a roar, but with a collapse. The bread riots in St. Petersburg turned into a revolution. The soldiers, the same men Anastasia had nursed, the same regiments that had guarded her cradle, mutinied. They refused to fire on the crowds. They joined them. The Tsar, stranded on his train, isolated and misinformed, was forced to abdicate. He signed the piece of paper that ended 300 years of Romanov rule in a railway carriage, thinking he was saving Russia. He was actually signing his family's death warrant. The stroke of the pen that dissolved the empire did not bring the peace Nicholas naively hoped for. It merely stripped the insulation from the wire. As the imperial train chugged back towards Tsarskoe Selo, carrying a fallen monarch to meet his confused children, the atmosphere shifted from the tragedy of politics to the tragedy of the personal. The abdication was the curtain falling on the Romanov dynasty, but for Anastasia, it was the rising of the iron bars. The war was no longer out there on the front lines. It had come home, and the imp was about to find that her father's signature had not bought them freedom, but had transformed their palace into a waiting room for the end of the world. When Nicholas II returned to the Alexander Palace on March 9, 1917, he was no longer the Tsar of all the Russias. He was simply Colonel Romanov, a private citizen under house arrest. Anastasia watched from the window as the gates, which had always opened to let them out into their vast empire, were now locked to keep them in. The psychological shock of this transition is difficult to overstate. For 16 years, Anastasia's world had been defined by deference. Men bowed, women curtsied, and the word of her father was law. Overnight, the polarity of their universe reversed. The guards at the gates were no longer the elite Cossacks or the fiercely loyal Chevalier Guard. They were rough, revolutionary soldiers who wore their caps askew, smoked incessantly, and looked at the imperial family not with reverence, but with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. The imp was now an inmate, and her home had become a luxury prison. The atmosphere inside the palace during those first months of captivity was a strange, suffocating twilight. The provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, was trying to walk a tightrope, keeping the radicals happy by imprisoning the Tsar, while trying to ensure the family wasn't murdered by the mob. For Anastasia, this meant a life of surreal contradictions. They still had French chefs, they still dressed for dinner, and they still had their tutors. But the corridors were patrolled by men who would deliberately blow smoke in their faces or utter obscenities as the Grand Duchesses walked by. Anastasia, with her sharp tongue and rebellious spirit, found this harder to bear than her more stoic sisters. She would glare back. She would refuse to look down. There is a story of a guard who, seeing Anastasia peering out of a window, raised his rifle and fired a shot that shattered the glass just inches above her head. It was a warning shot in every sense. The glass bubble of her childhood had been shattered, and the real world was armed and dangerous. To pass the time and to keep from going mad in the stale air of the palace, the family turned to physical labor. The Tsar, stripped of his empire, took up a shovel. He decided to turn the palace lawns into a vegetable garden to feed the family. There is a profound pathos in the image of Anastasia, the granddaughter of Victoria, dressed in old skirts and a headscarf, breaking the frozen earth alongside her father. They planted turnips and cabbages in the shadow of the golden eagles that still adorned the gates. For the soldiers watching through the fence, it was entertainment, a zoo exhibit of fallen royalty. For Anastasia, it was perhaps the first honest work she had ever done. She threw herself into it with her characteristic manic energy, hauling water and digging trenches, trying to sweat out the fear that hung over the house like a fog. But the physical humiliation was compounded by a sudden devastating loss of vanity. In the spring of 1917, a severe measles outbreak swept through the palace, infecting all the children. It was a brutal illness accompanied by high fevers and delirium. Anastasia, usually so robust, was laid low. As they recovered, their hair began to fall out in clumps. To save it, and to manage the hygiene of the sick room, the decision was made to shave their heads. The famous photographs from this period are shocking. The four beautiful Grand Duchesses, the pearls of the Romanov dynasty, sit on the garden bench looking like prisoners of war. Their skulls are bare, their eyes huge and haunted in their pale faces. Anastasia, stripped of her golden curls, looked vulnerable, exposed, almost genderless. Yet, even in this, she found a way to rebel. She wore hats at jaunty angles. She made jokes about her baldness. She tried to turn the humiliation into a costume, a performance, because if she stopped performing, the terror might overwhelm her. By the summer of 1917, the political situation in St. Petersburg, now renamed Petrograd to sound less German, was boiling over. The Bolsheviks were gaining power. The crowds were demanding the Tsar's blood. Kerensky realized that the Alexander Palace was no longer safe. If the mob stormed the gates, the family would be torn to pieces. He made the decision to move them. But where? The British option, exile to England, had been quietly killed by King George V. The king, fearing that the presence of his unpopular Russian cousins would destabilize his own throne, had prioritized his crown over his family. It was a betrayal that sealed Anastasia's fate. Without the sanctuary of Windsor, there was only one direction left to go: east, into the depths of Siberia. In August 1917, the family was told to pack. They were not told their destination. They packed with the confusion of people who did not know if they were going on a holiday or to an execution. Anastasia packed her photo albums, her diaries, and her small treasures. They left the palace at dawn, driven to a siding where a train waited under the cover of darkness. As the train chugged away from Tsarskoe Selo, Anastasia looked out the window at the receding spires of her home. She would never see it again. The journey took them across the spine of Russia, over the Ural Mountains, into the vast emptiness of the Siberian plain. They arrived in Tyumen and boarded a steamer, the Rus, a name dripping with irony, for the final leg of the journey to Tobolsk. Tobolsk was a sleepy, snowbound backwater, a town known primarily as a dumping ground for political exiles. It was a place where history went to freeze. The family was lodged in the former governor's mansion. It was a comfortable, large bourgeois house, but it was not a palace. They had no running water in the bathrooms. The furniture was dusty. They were guarded by 300 soldiers. This period, the Tobolsk captivity, is often glossed over in histories. But for Anastasia, it was a time of profound psychological suspension. It was the eye of the storm. Life fell into a dull, repetitive rhythm. They had lessons in the morning. They performed plays in the evening, French comedies, Chekhov dramas, trying to recreate the culture they had lost. Anastasia was the star of these productions, throwing herself into the roles with a desperation that bordered on hysteria. She wrote letters to her friends, trying to sound cheerful. "We are all well. The weather is cold. We slide down the ice hills." But between the lines, the boredom and the anxiety screamed. The locals in Tobolsk were sympathetic. They would cross themselves when the family appeared on the balcony. Nuns from the nearby convent brought them food, eggs, milk, sugar, smuggled past the guards. For a few months, it seemed as if they might simply fade away into obscurity, living out their lives as forgotten exiles in the snow. But in October 1917, the world broke again. Far away in Petrograd, the Bolsheviks seized power. Lenin was in control. The moderate provisional government was gone. The news reached Tobolsk slowly, like a creeping frost, but the effects were immediate. The sympathetic guards were replaced by hardline revolutionaries. The allowance was cut. The luxuries, butter, coffee, cream, disappeared. The governor's mansion ceased to be a house arrest and became a prison camp. The winter of 1917 to 1918 was brutal. The temperature dropped to 40 degrees below zero. The windows iced over, turning the house into a dark, frozen tomb. Anastasia and her sisters were forced to wear their fur coats inside, but the physical cold was nothing compared to the chill of isolation. The letters from the outside world stopped coming. The rumors of rescue, of a dashing plot by loyal monarchists, or a secret mission by the British, faded into silence. Anastasia, now 16, was watching her father age rapidly. Nicholas, once the ruler of 1/6 of the Earth's surface, sat by the fire reading history books, seemingly resigned to his fate. Alexandra sat in her wheelchair, gray-faced and silent. The burden of morale fell on the children. Anastasia and Maria, the little pair, tried to be the spark of life. They flirted with the younger guards, trying to charm them into kindness, trying to find a human connection in the inhuman machinery of the revolution. Then came the separation, the event that tore the heart out of the family. In April 1918, a mysterious commissar arrived from Moscow, Vasily Yakovlev. He had orders to move the Tsar. But where? Moscow. To put him on trial or somewhere worse? The problem was Alexei. The Tsarevich had suffered a severe attack of hemophilia after sliding down the stairs on a sled. He was bedridden, in agony, unable to be moved. The family faced an impossible choice. Nicholas had to go. Alexandra, unwilling to leave her husband to face his fate alone, decided to go with him. But who would go and who would stay? It was decided that Maria would accompany the parents. Anastasia, Olga, and Tatiana would stay behind in Tobolsk to nurse the sick boy. The morning of the departure was a scene of wrenching grief. The wagons arrived in the courtyard. Anastasia stood in the mud, watching her parents and her sister Maria climb into the carriages. She did not know if she would ever see them again. As the gates opened and the convoy rumbled out, leaving Anastasia behind as the de facto head of the shattered household, the imp had to grow up instantly. For the next month, she was not just a sister. She was a nurse, a mother, and a guardian. She sat by Alexei's bed while he screamed in pain. She managed the household, dealing with the increasingly hostile guards who now viewed the remaining children as hostages. She organized the packing, sewing the last of the jewels into the clothes, preparing for the unknown journey that would reunite them. That journey came in May 1918. Alexei had recovered enough to travel. Anastasia, her sisters, and her brother were loaded onto the steamer Rus once more. It was the last voyage of the Romanov children. As the boat steamed west towards the Urals, Anastasia was reported to be in high spirits, running around the deck, happy to be moving, happy to be escaping the tomb of Tobolsk. She didn't know she was sailing directly into the slaughterhouse. The destination was Ekaterinburg, the capital of the Red Urals, a city that was a hotbed of Bolshevik fanaticism. The local Soviet there didn't want a trial for the Tsar. They wanted his head. When the train finally pulled into the Ekaterinburg station, the reception was terrifying. A mob surrounded the carriage, jeering, spitting, screaming for death. Anastasia, shielding her sick brother, stepped out into a nightmare. They were shoved into trucks and driven through the dark streets to a large white stone house owned by a merchant named Ipatiev. The house was surrounded by a high wooden palisade. The windows were painted over with whitewash. It was a fortress. It was a dungeon. It was the house of special purpose. As Anastasia walked through the front door of the Ipatiev house carrying her small bags, she was walking into the final act of the tragedy. The reunion with her parents and Maria was emotional, but brief. The reality of their new prison set in immediately. This was not the Alexander Palace. This was not the governor's mansion. This was a holding cell. The guards here were not regular soldiers. They were the Cheka, the secret police. They were hard, cold, and cruel. They occupied the upper floor, forcing the family into a few cramped rooms. There was no privacy. The guards walked into the bedrooms without knocking. They followed the girls to the lavatory, scribbling obscene graffiti on the walls depicting Rasputin and the Empress. Anastasia's life shrank to the size of a few rooms. The view from the window was a blank white smear of paint. The only sky she could see was a small patch of blue through the fortochka, the ventilation pane. The stifling heat of the Ural summer began to build, turning the house into an oven. Yet, even here, in the belly of the beast, the Victorian steel in her spine showed itself. She refused to be cowed. When the guards were rude, she was rude back. She taught the kitchen boy how to knit. She and Maria would sing songs in the evening, their voices drifting out over the palisade, haunting the people walking on the street below. She was sewing the diamonds into her corset, the armor that her mother insisted upon, spending hours stitching the hard stones into the fabric that covered her heart. She was preparing for an escape that she desperately wanted to believe was coming. She did not know that the White Army was approaching the city. and that their approach would not bring rescue, but would trigger the order for liquidation. The noose was tightening, the food became scarce, the guards became drunker, more unpredictable. Yakov Yurovsky, the new commandant, arrived with a cold professional detachment. He was not there to guard them. He was there to manage a problem. Anastasia, with her intuition, must have sensed the shift. The imp who had once ruled the nurseries of Tsarskoe Selo was now a prisoner number, a biological asset to be liquidated. As July 1918 began, the heat in the house became unbearable. The flies buzzed against the painted glass. The world outside had forgotten them, and in the basement below, the room was waiting. With the trap shut and the family secured within the house of special purpose, the clock began a terrifying, silent countdown. The journey across Russia was over, but the journey into the abyss had just begun. The basement was indeed waiting, a silent maw beneath the floorboards. But death would not come immediately. First, there had to be the purgatory of the wait, a final breathless interlude where the heat rose, the flies buzzed, and hope slowly suffocated in the whitewashed gloom. It was in this stagnant air that Anastasia would spend her final days, unaware that she was living through the last pause before the violence of history came crashing through the door. The final 2 weeks of Anastasia Nikolaevna's life were played out in a sensory atmosphere that can only be described as a suffocating, suspended animation. By early July 1918, the Ipatiev House had ceased to be a residence and had become a pressure cooker waiting to explode. The heat in Ekaterinburg was relentless, a thick, humid blanket that trapped the smells of the unwashed bodies, the cooking cabbage, and the stale tobacco smoke of the guards within the sealed rooms. Because the windows were painted over with lime to prevent the family from signaling to the outside world, the air circulation was non-existent. The imp was living in a whitewashed box, a sensory deprivation tank, where the only input was fear. Yet even in this stifling purgatory, the human instinct for normalcy persisted. Anastasia, with the resilience of a teenager who cannot fully grasp the concept of her own mortality, tried to carve out a life. She helped the cook make bread, kneading the dough with hands that had once worn white kid gloves. She and her sisters washed their own clothes in the bathtub, scrubbing the stains of their captivity from the few garments they had left. There was a singular, haunting friendship that blossomed in these final days, a detail that adds a layer of heartbreaking innocence to the slaughter that was to come. A young kitchen boy named Leonid Sednev, roughly the same age as Alexei, lived in the house. He was the only peer the children had seen in months. Anastasia and the others would often stand by the door, exchanging jokes or playing simple games with him. He represented a tether to the childhood they had lost. On the morning of July 16th, hours before the end, the Commandant Yurovsky ordered Leonid to leave the house, sending him to stay with relatives. The family was told he was being sent to visit his uncle. Anastasia and Alexei were devastated. They didn't know that Yurovsky was clearing the kill zone, removing the only innocent proletarian from the group, so that the imperial filth could be liquidated without collateral damage. Anastasia spent her final afternoon grieving the loss of her friend, unaware that his departure was the first toll of the bell. That evening, July 16th, was unremarkable. The family ate a meager dinner. The Tsar wrote in his diary, "The Empress played cards with the Tsar." At 10:30 p.m., they went to bed. Anastasia curled up on her camp bed, perhaps clutching her King Charles spaniel, Jimmy, the small dog that had become her shadow. Sleep in the Ipatiev house was never deep. It was always lighter than air, disturbed by the heavy boots of the sentries pacing above and the constant gnawing anxiety of the unknown. Outside, the White Army was closing in. The roar of artillery could be heard in the distance, a sound that to the Romanovs meant rescue, but to the Bolsheviks meant the deadline had arrived. The Ural Soviet had received the tacit approval from Moscow. There would be no trial. There would be no exile. There would only be erasure. Shortly after midnight, the family was awakened by Dr. Botkin, the faithful physician who had stayed with them to the bitter end. He told them that Commandant Yurovsky had ordered them to dress. The explanation was plausible, designed to prevent panic. There was unrest in the town, shooting in the streets, and for their own safety, they had to be moved to the basement. Anastasia, groggy and disoriented, rose from her bed. This was the moment the diamond armor became a fatal reality. Under the watchful eyes of her mother, she put on the special undergarments, the corsets and camisoles into which pounds of diamonds, emeralds, and pearls had been painstakingly sewn over the previous months. They were dressing for a journey. They were carrying the bank of the Romanov dynasty on their bodies, literally weighing themselves down with the past. Anastasia put on a simple dress, grabbed Jimmy, and joined the procession. The walk down the stairs was a funeral march, though the participants didn't know it. The Tsar carried the sickly Alexei in his arms. The Empress walked with difficulty. Anastasia followed, flanked by her sisters. They walked past the stuffed bear on the landing, past the sneering guards, down into the cool, damp air of the cellar. They were led into a small room, roughly 20 by 23 feet, with a vaulted ceiling and a single barred window high up in the wall. It was a cul-de-sac, a dead end. The room was empty. The Empress asked for chairs. Yurovsky ordered 2 to be brought. Alexandra sat in one. Nicholas placed Alexei in the other. The rest of the family, Anastasia, Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Dr. Botkin, the maid Demidova, the valet Trupp, and the cook Karitonov, stood behind them. They arranged themselves as if for a family photograph. Anastasia stood towards the back. She was 17 years and 1 month old. She looked at the heavy door, expecting it to open and reveal the trucks that would take them away. Instead, the door opened to reveal the apocalypse. Yurovsky stepped in, followed by a squad of secret police armed with revolvers. The room was suddenly crowded, the air thick with the smell of alcohol and latent violence. Yurovsky stepped forward and read a hastily scribbled order. In view of the fact that your relatives are continuing their attack on Soviet Russia, the Ural Executive Committee has decided to execute you. The silence that followed was brief but absolute. It was the moment the world stopped. Nicholas, confused, turned and said, "What? What?" He didn't understand. He turned back to his family. He never heard the answer. Yurovsky raised his Colt revolver and shot the Tsar point blank in the chest. Nicholas fell instantly. Then hell opened up in the basement. The squad opened fire. It was not a disciplined military execution. It was a frenzied massacre in a concrete box. The room filled with smoke, blinding the shooters. The noise was deafening, the screams of the women mixing with the roar of the guns. But amidst the chaos, something terrifying and inexplicable happened. The bullets fired at the Grand Duchesses seemed to be bouncing off. The gunmen, superstitious and terrified, watched as the girls stood amidst the hail of lead, screaming but not falling. One executioner later testified that he thought they were witches, that they were divinely protected. They didn't know about the diamonds. The bullets were striking the corsets, ricocheting off the hardest stones on earth, turning the girls' bodies into impenetrable shields. The wealth that was supposed to save their future was prolonging their agony. Anastasia and Maria, huddled against the wall, covering their heads with their arms, were the last to fall. The gunmen, realizing their bullets were ineffective, switched to a more primal method. They stopped shooting and advanced with bayonets. The horror of this moment is the most difficult to confront. Anastasia, the imp, the girl who climbed trees, was not killed instantly by a clean shot. She was fought. She struggled. When the bayonets failed to pierce the diamond-lined bodices, the men used the butts of their rifles. It was a bludgeoning. It was a savage, intimate violence that stripped away every vestige of royalty and reduced the scene to a brawl in a slaughterhouse. Finally, a shot to the head ended the screaming. Anastasia fell. Her dog, Jimmy, whose head had been crushed, lay beside her. The floor was a lake of blood. The smoke cleared to reveal a tangle of bodies. The white dresses stained crimson, the smell of gunpowder and iron overwhelming the senses. But the horror of the Ipatiev House was only the prologue to the grotesque comedy of errors that followed. A comedy that would inadvertently birth the legend of the survivor. The Bolsheviks had killed the family, but now they had to make them disappear. They had to ensure there were no relics, no shrines for future monarchists. Yurovsky, in a state of panic and exhaustion, ordered the bodies stripped and loaded onto a Fiat truck waiting in the courtyard. It was during this process that the diamond armor was discovered. As the soldiers began to undress the girls, they found the corsets heavy with jewels. They ripped the seams open, spilling diamonds into the blood and mud. The looting began immediately. To the Bolsheviks, this was final proof of the Tsar's greed. To history, it was the explanation for the miracle in the basement. The truck rumbled out of Ekaterinburg into the Koptiaki forest, seeking a place to hide the evidence. It was a disaster from start to finish. The truck got stuck in the mud. The mine shaft they had chosen, known as Ganina Yama, was too shallow. They threw the bodies in, stripped and mutilated, and tossed grenades down to collapse the shaft. But it wasn't enough. The locals had seen them. The secret was already leaking. Yurovsky, terrified that the approaching White Army would find the bodies, decided to move them again the next night. This second burial is the crucial pivot point of the Anastasia mystery. In the chaos of the second night, the truck bogged down again in a place called Porosenkov Log. Exhausted and desperate, Yurovsky decided to bury them right there in a shallow pit under the road. But to confuse anyone counting the bodies, he made a decision that would haunt the 20th century. He separated two of the bodies, the boy Alexei and one of the younger girls, either Maria or Anastasia. He ordered these two to be burned and buried in a separate pit, some distance away from the mass grave. The idea was that if the whites found the main grave with only 9 bodies, they wouldn't believe it was the imperial family, who numbered 11. The bodies were doused in sulfuric acid to disfigure the faces. They were burned with gasoline. The earth was shoveled over them. Railroad ties were placed on top to hide the disturbance. And then the Bolsheviks walked away. They believed they had erased the Romanovs from the face of the earth. But by separating the bodies, by failing to destroy them completely, and by creating that discrepancy in the count, Yurovsky had unwittingly planted the seed of the greatest mystery of the age. Within days, the White Army took Ekaterinburg. They rushed to the Ipatiev House. They found the basement. They found the bullet holes in the walls, the gouges from the bayonets, and the blood stains that had been hastily scrubbed but still shadowed the floor. But they found no bodies. The investigation began immediately, led by a meticulous legal investigator named Nikolai Sokolov. He found the mine shaft at Ganina Yama. He found finger bones, a corset stay, a doctor's dentures, and the corpse of Jimmy the Spaniel. But he could not find the main remains. He concluded that the family had been completely destroyed by acid and fire. However, the Soviet government, playing a game of geopolitical chess, refused to tell the truth. They announced that Nicholas II had been executed. But, and this is the lie that changed history, they claimed that the wife and children had been sent to a safe place. It was a strategic lie, designed to prevent the Germans from retaliating during the delicate peace negotiations. But to the world, it was a spark of hope. If the Empress and the children were safe, then Anastasia was alive. This spark landed in a world that was traumatized by the carnage of World War I. People were desperate for a miracle. They couldn't accept that the fairy tale had ended in a muddy ditch. The rumor mill began to churn. Sightings were reported everywhere. A girl in a train station in Perm, a young woman in a refugee camp in Crimea. The missing princess became a global archetype. The ambiguity of the grave, the official lies of the Soviets, and the romantic yearning of the public created a perfect vacuum. And nature, as always, rushed to fill it. Into this vacuum stepped the imposters. They came from the shadows of post-war Europe, broken women with fractured minds and mysterious pasts, sensing that the role of a lifetime was vacant. But the first few were easily dismissed. Crazy women, obvious frauds. It wasn't until February 1920, 2 years after the massacre, that the canal in Berlin would produce a candidate who would split the Romanov family in half and hold the world captivated for 60 years. The bridge between the real Anastasia and the phantom Anastasia is built on trauma. The real Anastasia died fighting for her life in a basement, surrounded by the smell of blood and smoke. The phantom Anastasia was born in a mental asylum, surrounded by the smell of disinfectant and despair. But for a grieving world, the phantom was preferable. The phantom allowed them to look away from the bayonets. It allowed them to believe that the diamonds had worked, that the imp had cheated death one last time. But before the phantom could rise, the silence had to settle. For a brief moment in history, Anastasia Nikolaevna was simply dead. Her bones lay under a muddy track in Siberia, unnoticed by the peasants walking over them. The acid had done its work. The face that had been photographed 1,000 times was gone. The voice that had mimicked generals and soothed dying soldiers was silenced. She was returned to the earth of the empire her father had lost. It should have been the end. It should have been the final curtain. But the 20th century was not done with her yet. The dead girl was about to become a commodity, a puzzle, and a weapon in a war of identity that would outlast the Soviet Union itself. But while the physical remains of the Grand Duchess were decomposing in the silent embrace of the Siberian earth, the idea of her was proving impossible to kill. The Soviets had created a mystery to hide a massacre, but they had underestimated the world's hunger for a miracle. As the chaos of the post-war world swirled, the vacuum left by the missing body began to pull at the sanity of the grief-stricken, preparing the stage for the most audacious act of identity theft in history. The grave was closed, but the water was rising, and from the cold depths of a German canal, a ghost was about to gasp for air and claim a crown that no longer existed. In the winter of 1920, nearly 2 years after the guns fell silent in the Ipatiev House, a new ghost rose from the freezing waters of the Landwehr Canal in Berlin. It was a resurrection that would cast a shadow over the rest of the 20th century, turning the tragedy of the Romanovs into a macabre parlor game. On a dark February night, a young woman threw herself off the Bendler Bridge, intending to die. She was pulled out by a police sergeant, shivering, undocumented, and refusing to speak. She was committed to the Dahldorf asylum as Fräulein Unbekannt, Miss Unknown. For months she lay in a bed in the mental ward, a silent, traumatized figure with scars on her body and a strange, jagged accent when she finally chose to whisper. But the asylum was a breeding ground for rumors, and in the post-war chaos of Berlin, filled with Russian émigrés dreaming of the past, A whisper was all it took. A fellow patient, observing the woman's regal bearing and the strange scars on her feet, made a suggestion that would ignite a global firestorm. Perhaps this broken creature was not a nobody. Perhaps she was the Grand Duchess Tatiana. The woman didn't deny it, but later she corrected the assumption. She wasn't Tatiana, she was Anastasia. Thus began the reign of Anna Anderson, the woman who would become the most famous imposter in human history. The timing of her emergence was psychologically perfect. The world was suffering from a collective case of denial. The massacre in Ekaterinburg was too gruesome, too absolute. The Soviet government's lies about the family's safety had planted a seed of hope, and the human heart, desperate for a happy ending to the horrors of the Great War, watered it. Anna Anderson did not look exactly like Anastasia. Her nose was too broad, her mouth too wide, but she possessed a terrifying, inexplicable charisma. She knew things. She knew the nicknames. She knew the layout of the bedrooms in Tsarskoe Selo. She had a deformity on her foot, a bunion, that matched the Grand Duchess's. She had scars that she claimed were from the Bolshevik bayonets. But more than the physical details, she had the attitude. She was imperious, demanding, and prone to hysterical rages. To the exiled Russian nobility, destitute and grieving in the tea rooms of Paris and Berlin, this haughtiness felt like proof. Only a Romanov could be that difficult. The Anna Anderson affair tore the surviving Romanov family apart. It became a war between those who desperately wanted to believe and those who knew the cold reality of physics and bullets. On one side were the romantics and the opportunists, people like Gleb Botkin, the son of the murdered doctor, who championed Anderson's cause, perhaps out of a childhood affection for the real Anastasia, or perhaps out of a need to keep the past alive. On the other side was the formidable Grand Duchess Olga Alexandrovna, the Tsar's sister and Anastasia's aunt. In 1925, Olga traveled to a hospital in Berlin to meet the claimant. It was a scene of unbearable tension. Olga, who had known the imp since birth, stared into the eyes of the stranger. She saw a resemblance, yes, particularly in the eyes. For a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, she wavered, but then she spoke to her. The chemistry was wrong, the memories were jumbled. The stranger spoke only German, a language the real Anastasia refused to speak during the war. Olga left the room weeping, declaring, "I am not leaving my niece. I am leaving a stranger." But the rejection of the aunt didn't stop the machine. Anderson's supporters argued that her trauma had scrambled her memory, that her refusal to speak Russian was a psychological block caused by the horror of her mother's German heritage being used against the family. The story became a sensation. It moved from the asylum to the courtroom. For decades, the German courts were tied up in the longest civil case in their history, trying to determine if this woman was the heir to the defunct Russian throne. It was a legal absurdity, suing for the rights to a non-existent crown in a non-existent empire, but it captured the world's imagination. Hollywood descended on the story like vultures. The 1956 film Anastasia, starring Ingrid Bergman, cemented the myth in the cultural consciousness. In the movie, the princess survives, reclaims her heritage, and walks away from the throne for love. It was the ending we wanted. It was the ending the real Anastasia deserved. But it was a lie that effectively erased the real girl. The public fell in love with the survivor and forgot the victim. The gruesome reality of the Ipatiev basement was sanitized, replaced by a cinematic fantasy of amnesia and royal recognition. While Anna Anderson lived out her life in a bubble of delusion, eventually marrying an American eccentric and living in chaotic squalor in Virginia, surrounded by cats and paranoia, The real Anastasia lay in the mud of Porsenkov log. The irony is devastating. The imposter lived the life of a celebrity, granting interviews and receiving bowing visitors, while the true Grand Duchess was rotting in a shallow grave, nameless and unmourned. Anderson died in 1984, cremated before anyone could challenge her DNA, taking her secret to the grave. Her tombstone read, Anastasia Manahan. Even in death she stole the name. But the earth does not keep secrets forever. In the late 1970s, a Russian geologist named Alexander Avdonin and a filmmaker named Geli Ryabov began a secret, dangerous quest to find the grave. Working in the shadow of the KGB, they located the site based on the suppressed reports of Yurovsky. They found the skulls. They found the bones stained green by the copper bullets, but they reburied them, terrified of the Soviet authorities. It wasn't until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 that the grave was officially opened. The world watched in morbid fascination as the mud yielded its treasures, 9 skeletons. The forensic analysis was a masterclass in modern science meeting historical tragedy. The skeletons were reassembled. Computer modeling was used to superimpose the faces of the family onto the skulls. The height, the dental work, the injuries, everything matched. But there was a problem. A terrifying mathematical discrepancy. There were only 9 bodies. The Tsar was there. The Empress is there. 3 of the daughters were there. The servants were there. But 2 bodies were missing. Alexei, the hemophiliac heir, was gone. And one of the younger daughters, either Maria or Anastasia, was missing. The missing princess hysteria flared up again with nuclear intensity. If the body wasn't in the grave, then Anna Anderson must have been telling the truth. The believers felt vindicated. The skeptics were baffled. Was it possible? Had the diamond armor actually allowed one girl to crawl away into the forest? Had the Bolsheviks failed to kill the imp? Science, however, has no sentimentality. To solve the mystery once and for all, the scientists needed DNA. They needed a reference sample from the female line of the Romanovs to match against the skeletons. They turned to the most famous living relative of the Romanovs, a man who carried the same mitochondrial DNA as the Empress Alexandra, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. In a twist of historical poetry, the husband of the British Queen, the man who represented the survival of the monarchy, provided the blood that would prove the destruction of his Russian cousins. Philip's DNA was a perfect match to the remains of the woman and the 3 girls in the grave. The Empress and her daughters were identified. But what of Anna Anderson? A sample of her tissue had been preserved at a hospital in Charlottesville, Virginia, from a surgery she had undergone years before her death. The test was run. The world held its breath. The result was definitive and brutal. Anna Anderson had 0 relation to the Romanovs. She was not a Grand Duchess. She was Franziska Szankowska, a Polish factory worker with a history of mental illness. The greatest mystery of the 20th century was a fabrication, a long con played on a grieving world. Yet, even with Anderson debunked, the absence of the 2 bodies kept the door slightly ajar. For 16 years, from 1991 to 2007, the ghost of Anastasia lingered in that gap. The Russian Orthodox Church canonized the family in 2000, but they wrestled with the incompleteness of the relics. How could they pray to a saint whose body might still be walking the earth, or worse, lost in a swamp? The narrative remained unfinished. The tragedy lacked its final period. It was not until the summer of 2007 that the final piece of the puzzle was unearthed and the last shred of hope was extinguished. A group of amateur historians refusing to give up expanded the search area in the Koptyaki forest. 70 meters away from the main grave, they found a second, smaller pit. It was essentially a fire pit, a place of intense burning. Inside, they found 44 bone fragments. That was all that was left. 44 shards of calcified bone, severely damaged by fire and acid. They found 3 bullets. They found fragments of a ceramic jar used to hold sulfuric acid. The forensic anthropologists went to work. The bones belonged to 2 individuals, a boy aged 12 to 15 and a young woman aged 17 to 19. The DNA testing was repeated, this time using new, more advanced techniques. The results were indisputable. The boy was Alexei. The young woman was the missing daughter. The circle was closed. All 7 members of the Romanov family had died that night. No one had escaped. The diamond armor had not saved them. It had merely necessitated a more brutal disposal. The separation of the bodies was not evidence of survival. It was evidence of Yurovsky's chaotic attempt to hide his crime. The discovery of the second grave was the final death of Anastasia Nikolaevna. There was no more room for myths, no more space for imposters. The imp who had charmed the soldiers and tormented her tutors was reduced to a few ounces of burnt bone in a box. It was a stark, depressing end to a century of speculation. But in this finality, there was also a kind of liberation. The real Anastasia could finally be separated from the fake one. We could stop looking for the woman in the Virginia asylum and start mourning the girl in the Siberian basement. The legacy of Anastasia, however, is not just in her death. It is in the warning her life provides. She stands as a symbol of the fragility of the world order. In 1913, she stood on a balcony in the Kremlin, the daughter of the most powerful absolute monarch on earth, protected by an army of millions, blessed by the church and insulated by a fortune that defied calculation. 5 years later, she was beaten to death in a basement. Her fall was so absolute, so rapid that it defies comprehension. It reminds us that no amount of wealth, no amount of tradition, and no amount of divine right can protect a child when the structures of society collapse. Today, the remains of the imperial family lie in the St. Peter and Paul Cathedral in St. Petersburg. They are buried in a small chapel surrounded by the marble tombs of their ancestors, Peter the Great, Catherine the Great, Alexander the Second. But the Romanovs of 1918 are different. They are not buried as emperors. They are buried as passion bearers. The church has elevated them not for how they ruled, but for how they died, with meekness, with faith, and with resignation. Yet when one stands before the tomb of Anastasia, it is hard to feel the peace of sainthood. One feels the vibration of unfulfilled energy. One thinks of the camera she used to take pictures of herself in the mirror, looking for her own reflection. One thinks of the dog, Jimmy, clubbed to death at her feet. One thinks of the diamonds sewn into the corset, the glittering burden that failed to stop the steel. The story of Anastasia is the story of the 20th century's loss of innocence. We wanted to believe she survived because we wanted to believe that we hadn't become monsters. We wanted to believe that there was a limit to political violence, that a child could be spared. But the grave in Porosenkov log tells us the truth. There is no limit. The machine of history grinds everything to dust. The palaces, the dynasties, and the 17-year-old girls. In the end, Anastasia Nikolaevna does not belong to the monarchists or the movies or the church. She belongs to the silence of the snow in Tobolsk, the silence of the sealed room in the Ipatiev House, the silence of the forest where her bones lay for 90 years. It is a silence that asks us to look past the tiaras and the titles and see the terrified human girl who was forced to pay the ultimate price for a history she did not write. She was the Grand Duchess of nothing but the dark the princess of the heartbreaking finale, the girl who died twice, once by the bullet and once by the lie of her survival. And perhaps, now that the lie is gone, she can finally truly rest. The autopsy of the Romanov tragedy is complete. We have walked from the gilded cradles of Peterhof to the bloody floor of Ekaterinburg, and finally to the sterile laboratories where DNA stripped away the last vestiges of the fairy tale. The story of Anastasia Nikolaevna is not a mystery, it is a mirror. It reflects the terrifying randomness of fate. She was born into the highest echelons of human power, yet died with the helpless anonymity of a victim of gang violence. Her life was defined by the two great forces of her age: the biological curse of Queen Victoria's bloodline, which rotted the dynasty from within, and the ideological fire of the revolution, which destroyed it from without. For decades, we clung to the myth of Anna Anderson because the truth was too painful to accept. We preferred a mad woman in a Virginia farmhouse to the reality of a child dissolved by acid. But by accepting the truth that Anastasia died alongside her family, terrified and in pain, we grant her the only dignity left, the dignity of reality. She was not a magical survivor. She was a casualty. She was the collateral damage of an empire's collapse. Her legacy is not a crown, nor a legend. It is a warning. It reminds us that civilization is a thin veneer, that security is an illusion, and that when the world breaks, it is often the innocent, the imps, the daughters, the sisters, who fall into the cracks. Anastasia Nikolaevna has returned to her family in the cathedral, but she remains a ghost in our collective conscience, the eternal teenager standing in the basement waiting for a rescue that never came, reminding us forever of the terrible cost of power and the heartbreaking finality of hate.